Sadie, a Labrador abandoned in the freezing cold with her 2 newborn pups, fights to protect her family against impossible odds. Rescued by Logan, a man grieving his own losses, Sadie embarks on a journey of healing, trust, and resilience. Together, they face challenges from Sadie's neglectful former owner, legal battles, and their own fears. With the support of their small-town community, they emerge victorious, forming an unbreakable bond. Logan learns the power of second chances, while Sadie inspires an entire town to rally for justice. Their story, full of hope and transformation, shows that even in the darkest times, love and compassion can create miracles. Where are you watching from? What are your thoughts on Sadie and Logan's journey? Share your comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, DG Story, for more inspiring tales like this one. The winds howled like a pack of wolves, tearing through the empty streets of the small Midwestern town. Snowflakes swirled violently, blanketing every surface in an icy grip. Amidst the relentless storm, a shadow stumbled forward. Sadie, a Labrador with a frail frame, her ribs jutting against her thin coat. Her movements were sluggish, each step a battle against the snowdrifts that seemed determined to bury her alive. Clutched against her belly were 2 tiny puppies, their soft whimpers barely audible over the storm. Their bodies trembled as they burrowed closer to their mother, seeking warmth she could no longer provide. Sadie's breath came in shallow puffs, her strength nearly gone, but her resolve unbroken. She had nothing left but her love for her pups, and that was enough to keep her moving. The streets were eerily silent, save for the sharp whistle of the wind. Sadie scanned the surroundings with tired eyes, desperate for shelter. Her journey had begun days ago when her owner had shoved her out of the backyard, claiming she was too much trouble after her unexpected pregnancy. Sadie had roamed the outskirts of town, scavenging for scraps, but the food was scarce, and the cold merciless. Ahead, she spotted an old, decrepit barn leaning against the storm like a relic of a forgotten time. Its wooden planks creaked under the weight of the snow, but it was shelter. Sadie limped toward it, her paws raw and bleeding from the icy pavement. The barn's door hung ajar, allowing a faint glimmer of light to peek through. She nudged it open with her nose, her body trembling as she stepped inside. The barn was no haven. Its interior was just as frigid, with gaping holes in the roof and walls. However, the wind was less fierce here, and that was enough. Sadie collapsed onto the dirt floor, curling her body protectively around her pups. She licked them gently, her tongue rough yet tender. The puppies whimpered softly, their tiny cries breaking the heavy silence of the barn. Sadie's mind drifted to a time before all this. A warm house, a full belly, the sound of her owner's laughter as they played in the yard. That life felt like a distant dream now, replaced by a harsh reality that threatened to take everything from her. Her eyelids grew heavy, and for a moment, she thought about giving in to the exhaustion. But the faint cries of her puppies pulled her back. "I won't let anything happen to you," she thought, though her body screamed otherwise. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. The storm raged on outside, the wind rattling the barn's fragile structure. Sadie's breath grew weaker, her body shivering uncontrollably. She closed her eyes, praying for a miracle, and then it came. A faint beam of light cut through the darkness, accompanied by the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow. Sadie's ears perked weakly as she lifted her head. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man bundled in a heavy coat and scarf, his flashlight sweeping across the barn. His steps quickened when the light landed on Sadie and her pups. "Oh my God," he muttered, his voice trembling. The man knelt beside her, removing his coat and draping it over her shivering form. Sadie blinked slowly, too weak to react. She felt herself being lifted, the man's arms cradling her gently. Her puppies were wrapped in a warm blanket, their tiny bodies nestled together. "You're safe now," the man said softly, his voice filled with determination. "I won't let anything happen to you or your babies." For the first time in days, the cold began to fade, replaced by a flicker of warmth. Sadie nestled closer, her body still trembling but her heart daring to hope. Logan Parker gripped the steering wheel of his aging truck, glancing at the bundle of blankets in the passenger seat. Beneath the layers of fabric, the Labrador and her two pups lay huddled together, their soft breaths barely visible in the cold air. Logan turned the heater on full blast, though it sputtered weakly in protest. The drive home was slow, the roads slick with ice and snow. Logan's mind raced as he replayed the scene in the barn. He hadn't expected to find anything alive in the abandoned structure, much less a dog on the brink of freezing to death. Her ribs were visible, her paws cracked and bleeding, yet there was something in her eyes, an unyielding determination that had gripped his heart. "This isn't what I planned," Logan muttered to himself, glancing at the dog. It had been years since Logan had taken care of anything other than himself. After losing his wife and daughter in a car accident, he had shut himself off from the world, retreating to his small house on the outskirts of town. The idea of taking on responsibility again, even for a stray dog and her pups, felt like reopening old wounds, but leaving them behind in that barn hadn't been an option. As the truck pulled into his driveway, Logan exhaled heavily. His modest home, with its peeling paint and sagging porch, didn't look any more welcoming than the barn. Still, it was warm inside, and for now, that was enough. He stepped out of the truck, carefully lifting the blanket-wrapped bundle from the passenger seat. The dog let out a faint whimper, her head lifting slightly to watch him. "It's okay, girl," Logan said, his voice soft. "Let's get you and your babies inside." The warmth of the house hit them immediately. Logan laid the mother and her pups on an old comforter he had spread out near the fireplace. The Labrador curled protectively around her puppies, her eyes darting nervously between Logan and the room. "Not a fan of humans." "Ha!" Logan murmured as he crouched down, his movements slow and deliberate. "Can't say I blame you." The dog's ears twitched, but she didn't growl. Logan took it as a small victory. He grabbed a bowl from the kitchen, filling it with water and setting it within reach. Then he opened a can of dog food he had dug out of a cupboard, placing it beside the water. "Here," he said, retreating a few steps to give her space. "You've got to eat something." The smell of food caught her attention. Slowly, hesitantly, the dog stretched her neck forward, taking a cautious sniff. She licked the edge of the bowl, then began eating in small, careful bites. Logan watched her, leaning against the counter. He couldn't help but notice how thin she was, her fur patchy and dull. The pups, nestled against her belly, were no better, tiny and frail, their breaths shallow. He ran a hand through his messy hair, letting out a frustrated sigh. "What am I doing?" he muttered. The next morning, Logan woke to the sound of faint whimpering. He had spent the night on the couch, a blanket draped over him, though he had barely slept. Rising to his feet, he glanced over at the makeshift bed near the fireplace. The Labrador was awake, her eyes fixed on him. Her body was tense, but she didn't move as Logan approached. "Morning," he said softly, kneeling beside her. The pups stirred slightly, letting out tiny squeaks as they squirmed closer to their mother. Logan reached out, holding his hand just inches away from the dog's nose. She sniffed cautiously, her dark eyes scanning his face. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" he said with a small smile. "Guess we've got that in common." The sound of a knock at the door broke the moment. Logan frowned, standing up and heading toward the front of the house. When he opened the door, he found himself face to face with April, the town's young veterinarian. "Logan," she said, brushing snow off her coat. "I heard from Mrs. Carter you picked up a stray last night. Thought I'd check in." Logan blinked, caught off guard by her sudden appearance. Yeah," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "She's by the fireplace." April walked in, her sharp eyes immediately landing on the dog and her pups. "Oh, poor thing," she murmured, kneeling down. "She's in rough shape," Logan said, folding his arms. "I didn't know what else to do." April glanced up at him, a small smile playing on her lips. "Well, for someone who doesn't know what to do, you've done pretty well so far." Her words caught him off guard, but he shrugged them off. "She needs more than I can give her," he said. April nodded, her tone soft but firm. "You've already given her a chance, Logan. That's more than most people would do." Sadie lay quietly near the fireplace, her body curled protectively around her pups. The warmth of the room eased the ache in her frozen limbs, but her mind remained alert. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of Logan's presence in the room made her muscles tense. Logan sat on the couch a few feet away, fiddling with a mug of coffee. He watched her in silence, his expression a mix of exhaustion and curiosity. April had left after administering some basic care to Sadie and her pups, leaving behind a small box of supplies and a list of instructions. "She's skittish," April had said before leaving, "but she's not aggressive. Give her time, and she'll come around." Logan wasn't so sure. He'd seen the way Sadie's eyes darted toward him every time he moved, her body coiled like a spring. Trust didn't come easily, and he couldn't blame her for that. "I'm not gonna hurt you," Logan said softly, his voice breaking the quiet. Sadie's ears twitched, but she didn't lift her head. Her pups stirred beside her, tiny squeaks escaping their small bodies. Logan smiled faintly at the sound. "You've done a good job keeping them safe," he continued. "Better than most people would have managed out there." His words hung in the air, met with silence. Logan leaned back, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't used to talking so much, especially to someone or something that couldn't respond. Later that afternoon, Logan ventured outside to fetch more firewood. The storm had passed, but the cold lingered, biting at his skin as he stepped onto the snow-covered porch. He paused, his breath forming clouds in the icy air, and glanced back at the window. Through the frosted glass, he could see Sadie's silhouette near the fireplace. She hadn't moved from her spot, but her head was up, her ears perked as if she were listening for him. Logan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding and turned toward the woodpile. Inside, Sadie shifted uneasily. The house was quiet, the warmth of the fire now a foreign comfort she wasn't sure she could trust. Her eyes flicked toward the door every few seconds, her body tensed for the possibility of danger. She had learned long ago that kindness was fleeting. People who spoke gently could turn cruel without warning. The man who had once been her owner had started with soft words and warm pats, but that had quickly turned to harsh commands and cold indifference. Sadie's gaze fell on her pups, who were nuzzled close to her belly. She lowered her head, licking each one in turn. They were her world now, the only reason she had fought so hard to survive. The sound of the door opening pulled her from her thoughts. Sadie's head shot up, her ears flat against her skull as Logan stepped inside, his boots leaving wet prints on the wooden floor. "It's just me," he said, his tone calm. "No need to panic." Sadie didn't relax, but she didn't growl either. Logan took that as progress. He set the firewood down and crouched near the fireplace, careful not to get too close. "Brought you something," he said, pulling a small blanket from the pile of supplies April had left. He unfolded it and set it on the floor, just within Sadie's reach. The Labrador eyed the blanket warily, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air. Logan stayed where he was, his movements slow and deliberate. "It's warm," he said softly. "Might help with those pups of yours." Sadie hesitated for a long moment before cautiously extending her neck to inspect the blanket. Her nose brushed against the fabric, and she let out a low huff. Satisfied, she nudged the blanket closer, adjusting it beneath her and the pups. Logan allowed himself a small smile. "That's a good girl," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. That evening, as the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Logan sat at the kitchen table with a notebook in front of him. He was making a list: food, supplies, anything he could think of to help Sadie and the pups recover. His pen paused as a thought struck him. What if she never fully trusted him? What if, no matter what he did, Sadie couldn't let go of the fear that had been etched into her by whoever had abandoned her? He glanced toward the fireplace. Sadie was lying down, her head resting on her paws, but her eyes were open, watching him intently. Logan met her gaze and offered a small, reassuring nod. "We'll figure it out," he murmured. "One step at a time." Sadie blinked slowly, her ears flicking forward. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a start. It had been a week since Logan found Sadie in the barn, and while her physical health was slowly improving, her guarded demeanor remained unchanged. She had started eating more, her coat looked less matted, and the pups were beginning to grow stronger. Logan found himself smiling at their small milestones. The way they squeaked when they tried to move or how their tiny tails wagged faintly as they nursed. Despite the progress, Sadie remained distant. She tolerated Logan's presence but never fully relaxed. If he moved too quickly or got too close, her body would tense, and her eyes would narrow with suspicion. She's been through a lot, April had reminded him during her second visit. It'll take time. Time was something Logan was willing to give. One chilly afternoon, as Logan was cleaning the fireplace, the sound of a vehicle pulling into the driveway caught his attention. He peered out the window and frowned. A rusted pickup truck had come to a stop in front of his house. A man stepped out, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. He was tall, with a stocky build and an air of arrogance. Logan didn't recognize him, but there was something about the way he carried himself that put Logan on edge. Logan opened the door and stepped onto the porch. "Can I help you?" he called out, his tone cautious. The man smirked, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. "Name's Roy. Heard you've got my dog." Logan's stomach tightened. "Your dog?" "Yeah, Black Lab had a couple of pups. She's mine." Logan's eyes narrowed. "She was abandoned in the middle of a snowstorm. You expect me to believe you've been looking for her?" Roy shrugged. "Didn't say I was looking. Just figured I'd take her back now." Logan stepped forward, his stance firm. "She's not yours anymore." Roy's smirk faded, replaced by a hard glare. "Look, pal, I don't care what kind of sob story you've got going on. That dog and those pups are worth money. You think I'm just gonna walk away?" The implication made Logan's blood boil. "She's not a piece of property," he snapped. Sadie appeared at the door, her body low and defensive as she growled softly. Logan glanced over his shoulder, his heart aching at the fear in her eyes. "You've done enough damage," Logan said, turning back to Roy. "Leave." Roy took a step closer. "You sure you want to do this the hard way?" The tension was palpable, and for a moment, Logan considered calling the police. But before he could respond, Roy let out a derisive laugh and held up his hands. "Fine," he said, backing toward his truck. "But this isn't over." As Roy drove off, Logan clenched his fists, his mind racing. He knew Roy would be back, and he couldn't shake the fear that the man might try to take Sadie and her pups by force. That evening, Logan sat at the kitchen table, staring at the legal forms April had dropped off earlier. She had suggested filing for ownership of Sadie and her pups to prevent anyone, including Roy, from claiming them. "You need to protect them, Logan," she had said. The problem was, Logan wasn't sure if he could. He barely scraped by with his modest income, and the thought of a legal battle with someone like Roy felt overwhelming. He glanced toward Sadie, who was lying near the fireplace with her pups nestled against her. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw something other than fear. There was a flicker of hope, faint but unmistakable. Logan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I won't let him take you," he said quietly. "I promise." The next few days were tense. Logan kept a watchful eye on the road, half expecting Roy to return at any moment. He also began reaching out to neighbors and friends, sharing Sadie's story and asking for advice. Word spread quickly through the small town. and soon, people began to rally behind Logan. Mrs. Carter, who lived down the street, offered to help with food and supplies. A local lawyer, Mr. Bennett, volunteered to assist with the legal paperwork free of charge. "It's not just about the dog," Bennett said when Logan expressed his gratitude. "It's about doing what's right." Despite the support, Logan couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was coming. That feeling was confirmed one night when he returned home to find the back door ajar. His heart sank as he stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. The living room was in disarray, furniture knocked over and drawers pulled open. "Sadie," Logan called out, his voice laced with panic. A faint growl came from the bedroom. Logan rushed in to find Sadie standing over her pups, her teeth bared as she faced the open window. A faint trail of footprints in the snow outside told him everything he needed to know. Roy had been there. Logan knelt beside Sadie, his hand resting on her back. "It's okay," he murmured, though his voice trembled. "I'm here." Sadie's growl softened, and she leaned into his touch. For the first time, Logan felt the weight of her trust and the responsibility that came with it. The days following Roy's intrusion were a blur of activity. Logan's small house became a hub of concerned neighbors, legal documents, and a steady stream of advice. Sadie remained vigilant, staying close to her pups and reacting to every noise with a low growl. Logan knew her trust in him had grown, but the scars from her past were far from healed. "This isn't just about you anymore, Logan," Mr. Bennett said one evening as he spread a pile of papers across the kitchen table. "This is about making sure people like Roy don't think they can get away with this." Logan nodded, his jaw tight. He had filed the paperwork for ownership of Sadie and her pups, but the process was slow, and Roy was relentless. Every day, Logan felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he refused to back down. One morning, Logan woke to the sound of his phone buzzing. Groggily, he reached for it, his heart skipping a beat when he saw April's name on the screen. "Logan, turn on the news," she said, her voice urgent. Logan hurried to the living room and switched on the TV. The local news station was running a story about a growing movement in town, a campaign to support Sadie and her pups, images of Logan's house, Sadie by the fireplace, and even a brief interview with Mrs. Carter flashed across the screen. "I just think what Logan's doing is inspiring," Mrs. Carter said to the reporter. "These animals deserve a chance, and he's giving them that." The segment ended with a call to action, urging viewers to donate supplies or join the effort to protect Sadie. Logan sat back, stunned. "You're a celebrity now," April said with a laugh when Logan called her back. "This isn't what I wanted," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "No, but it's what you needed," she replied. "People care. Logan, let them help." Despite the community's support, tension boiled over when Roy showed up at Logan's house again. This time, he wasn't alone. Two men stood with him, their presence adding an air of intimidation. "You think a few donations and some feel-good stories are gonna stop me?" Roy sneered, his arms crossed as he stood at the edge of the driveway. Logan stepped onto the porch, his fists clenched. "You're trespassing," he said firmly. Roy's smirk widened. "You don't own this dog, Parker, and if you think some paperwork's gonna change that, you're more naive than I thought." Sadie appeared at the door, her growl low and menacing. Roy's eyes flicked toward her, and for a brief moment, Logan thought he saw fear flash across the man's face. "I'm not scared of you," Roy said, but his voice faltered slightly. Before Logan could respond, the sound of tires crunching on gravel filled the air. A police car pulled into the driveway, its lights flashing. Roy and his men froze as Officer Hernandez stepped out, her expression stern. "We got a report of a disturbance," she said, her eyes sweeping over the scene. "What's going on here?" Roy opened his mouth to speak, but Logan cut him off. "This man has been harassing me and threatening to take my dog," he said. Officer Hernandez turned to Roy. "Is that true?" Roy hesitated, his bravado faltering. "That dog belongs to me," he said finally. "I have every right to take it back." "Do you have proof of ownership?" Hernandez asked, her tone neutral but firm. Roy faltered again, his gaze shifting nervously. "Not on me." Hernandez sighed. "Until you can provide legal proof, you have no claim here. Leave the property immediately, or I'll have to take further action." Roy glared at Logan, but he didn't argue. With a grunt, he motioned for his men to follow him back to the truck. "This isn't over," he said as he climbed into the driver's seat. Logan watched them drive away, his shoulders slumping with relief. Hernandez turned to him, her expression softening. "You're doing the right thing, Logan," she said. "Don't let him scare you." Logan nodded, though the knot in his stomach remained. That night, Logan sat by the fireplace, Sadie lying at his feet. The pups were asleep, their tiny bodies curled together in the warmth of the room. Logan reached down, his hand resting gently on Sadie's head. "We'll get through this," he murmured. "I don't know how yet, but we will." Sadie looked up at him, her eyes reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and trust. For the first time, Logan felt like they were truly in this together. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that made Logan's skin prickle. Outside, the snow had started to fall again, blanketing the small house in an unsettling calm. Sadie lay near the fireplace, her pups nestled against her side. Logan, seated at the kitchen table, stared at a pile of paperwork he hadn't touched in hours. The day's events had left him drained. Roy's threats lingered in his mind, gnawing at his resolve. The community's support gave him hope, but the fear that Roy might take more drastic action kept him on edge. As Logan rose to stretch, a faint sound reached his ears. It was distant, barely audible over the crackling fire, but it was there, the crunch of footsteps on snow. Logan froze, his heart pounding as he strained to listen. The sound grew louder, more deliberate. Someone was outside. Sadie's ears perked, and a low growl rumbled in her throat. She stood, positioning herself between her pups and the door, her body tense and ready. Logan moved to the window, carefully peering out. Through the frosted glass, he caught a glimpse of a shadow moving near the side of the house. His stomach tightened. "Stay here," he whispered to Sadie, though he wasn't sure if the words were for her or himself. Grabbing the baseball bat he kept by the door, Logan stepped onto the porch. The cold air bit at his face, but the adrenaline coursing through his veins kept him moving. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice firm. There was no answer, but the sound of movement near the back of the house made his grip on the bat tighten. He rounded the corner just in time to see a figure climbing through a partially opened window. Logan's blood ran cold as he recognized Roy. "Hey!" Logan shouted, charging forward. Roy scrambled through the window and into the house, his boots hitting the floor with a dull thud. Inside, Sadie's growl deepened, her teeth bared as she stood protectively over her pups. "Get out of my house!" Logan yelled, chasing after Roy. Roy ignored him, his eyes fixed on Sadie. "There you are," he sneered, taking a step toward her. Sadie didn't retreat. Her growl turned into a bark, loud and sharp, as she lunged forward. Roy stumbled back, startled, but he quickly recovered. "You think you can scare me?" he spat, reaching for the pups. Before Logan could intervene, Sadie leapt at Roy, her body a blur of motion. She knocked him off balance, her jaws snapping inches from his face. Roy fell backward, cursing as he scrambled to push her off. Logan rushed to pull Sadie away, his heart racing. "Enough, girl," he said, his voice firm but calm. Sadie hesitated, her eyes locked on Roy. With a soft whimper, she stepped back, positioning herself between her pups and the intruder. Roy staggered to his feet, his face red with anger. "You're gonna regret that," he snarled, pointing a finger at Logan. Before he could make another move, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Logan felt a wave of relief as flashing lights illuminated the driveway. Officer Hernandez stepped into the house moments later, her gaze sharp as she took in the scene. Roy stood in the corner, muttering under his breath, while Sadie remained by her pups, her body still tense. "Care to explain what's going on here?" Hernandez asked, her tone clipped. Logan recounted the events quickly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. Hernandez turned to Roy, her expression unreadable. "Breaking and entering, trespassing, and attempted theft," she said. "You're not making a great case for yourself." Roy opened his mouth to argue, but Hernandez silenced him with a glare. "Save it for the judge," she said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. As Roy was led outside, Logan sank into a chair, his body sagging with relief. Sadie approached him cautiously, her pups trailing behind. "You did good, girl," Logan said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out, resting a hand on her head. Sadie leaned into his touch, her body finally relaxing. That night, the house was quiet once again. Logan sat by the fireplace, Sadie lying at his feet with her pups. The events of the evening replayed in his mind, but for the first time in days, he felt a sense of peace. Sadie had shown incredible courage, defending her pups and her new home without hesitation. Logan couldn't help but admire her strength, her unwavering determination to protect those she loved. "You're amazing, you know that?" he said softly, scratching behind her ears. Sadie looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting a mixture of trust and gratitude. Logan smiled, his heart swelling with a newfound sense of purpose. "We've got a long road ahead," he said, "but we'll get there, together." The morning after Roy's arrest dawned clear and cold, the sunlight reflecting off the fresh blanket of snow. Logan stood on the porch, sipping a cup of coffee as he watched Sadie explore the yard. Her pups, now wobbling on unsteady legs, tumbled through the snow with playful abandon. It was a sight that filled Logan with a quiet sense of victory. For the first time, Sadie seemed at ease, her tail wagging slightly as she sniffed at the snow-covered bushes. The events of the previous night still lingered in his mind, but the fear that had once gripped him was beginning to fade. Inside, Logan's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. He stepped back into the warmth of the house, glancing at the screen. It was April. "Morning," he said, answering the call. "Morning," she replied, her tone bright. "How are you holding up after last night?" Logan let out a small laugh. "Tired, but we're okay." Sadie's back to guarding her pups like the fierce little warrior she is. April chuckled. "She's got more fight in her than most people I know. Listen, I just wanted to let you know that the community is rallying behind you. We've got donations coming in, food, blankets, even a couple of people offering to cover the legal fees." Logan blinked in surprise. I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," April said gently. "Just accept the help. You and Sadie deserve it." The rest of the day was a whirlwind of activity. Neighbors stopped by with supplies, their faces lit with encouragement and kindness. One family brought a bag of high-quality dog food, while another handed Logan a hand-knitted blanket for Sadie and her pups. "It's not much," Mrs. Carter said, her cheeks pink from the cold. "But we wanted to help." Logan smiled, his gratitude evident. "It's more than enough. Thank you." Sadie watched the visitors from her spot near the fireplace, her body relaxed but her eyes cautious. Logan knelt beside her, scratching behind her ears. "They're here for you," he said softly. "For all of us." Sadie nuzzled his hand, her silent acknowledgement of the growing bond between them. The days passed quickly as Logan prepared for the upcoming court hearing. With Mr. Bennett's guidance, he gathered every piece of evidence he could: photographs of Sadie's condition when he found her, records from April's veterinary visits, and testimonies from neighbors who had witnessed her transformation. Logan also began sharing more of Sadie's story online. The post he had written about finding her in the barn had gained traction. drawing comments and messages of support from strangers across the country. "Your story gives me hope." One comment read, "Thank you for fighting for her." Another said, "Sadie is a hero. She deserves all the love in the world." The outpouring of support gave Logan the strength to keep going. The day of the hearing arrived with an icy wind that cut through Logan's jacket as he stood outside the courthouse. Sadie was not with him. April had offered to watch her and the pups while he focused on the legal proceedings. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation. Roy sat at a table on the other side of the room, his posture defiant as he spoke with his lawyer. Logan took his seat, glancing nervously at Mr. Bennett. "We've got this," Bennett said confidently. "Just tell the truth." When the hearing began, Logan felt his nerves settle as he recounted Sadie's journey. He spoke of finding her in the barn, her condition, and her unwavering determination to protect her pups. He described the break-in, the support from the community, and his commitment to giving her the life she deserved. Roy's lawyer tried to argue that Sadie still legally belonged to Roy, but the judge was visibly unimpressed. When the veterinarian records and photographic evidence were presented, it became clear that Sadie had been abandoned and neglected. Finally, the judge spoke. "The evidence presented here today is overwhelming. Mr. Parker, your actions have not only saved the lives of Sadie and her pups, but have demonstrated a level of care and compassion that goes beyond the call of duty. The court grants you full ownership of Sadie and her puppies." Logan exhaled deeply, relief washing over him. Roy muttered something under his breath as he stormed out of the courtroom, but Logan didn't care. He had won. That evening, Logan returned home to find Sadie waiting at the door. Her tail wagged hesitantly as he stepped inside, a small gesture that made his heart swell. "We did it," he said, kneeling to scratch behind her ears. "You're officially part of the family now." Sadie pressed her head against his chest, her body relaxing completely for the first time. The pups tumbled around them, their playful squeaks filling the room with warmth and life. As Logan sat by the fire that night, Sadie curled up beside him with her pups. He thought about everything they had been through, the fear, the challenges, and the victories. "You're not just survivors," he said softly. "You're fighters, and we're going to be okay." Sadie looked up at him, her eyes reflecting trust and gratitude. Logan smiled, feeling a peace he hadn't known in years. For the first time, their home felt whole. Winter gradually loosened its grip on the town, giving way to the first signs of spring. The once barren yard surrounding Logan's home now sparkled with patches of green, and the sunlight felt warmer as it poured through the windows. Inside, the house was livelier than ever. Sadie had settled into her new life with an ease that Logan hadn't thought possible just weeks ago. The pups, now growing stronger each day, had begun exploring every corner of the house. Their boundless energy brought an infectious joy, filling the quiet home with laughter and the sound of tiny paws scampering across the floor. Logan often found himself smiling as he watched them wrestle with each other or tumble over Sadie's tail. Sadie, for her part, had transformed. Her coat had regained its sheen, her body was stronger, and her once cautious eyes now shone with confidence. She followed Logan wherever he went, a silent but constant companion who had come to trust him completely. One crisp morning, Logan decided it was time for an adventure. He loaded Sadie and the pups into his truck, along with a small picnic basket and a few toys for the pups. "We're going to the park today," he said as he secured their leashes. "You're going to love it." The drive to the park was quiet, with Sadie lying in the back seat and the pups snuggled against her. When they arrived, Logan opened the truck door and led them onto a wide, grassy field. The pups darted forward, their tiny tails wagging furiously as they discovered the joy of open space. Sadie followed at a slower pace, her nose twitching as she sniffed the fresh air. Logan set up a blanket under a large oak tree and sat down, watching as Sadie gradually began to relax. She stayed close to the pups at first, her protective instincts still sharp. But it wasn't long before she joined in their playful antics. "That's it, girl," Logan said, his voice full of encouragement. "Enjoy yourself." The park wasn't crowded, but a few other dog owners had gathered nearby. One of them, a woman with a golden retriever, approached cautiously. "She's beautiful," the woman said, nodding toward Sadie. "Is she yours?" Logan smiled. "Yeah, she and her pups. It's been a journey, but they're family now." The woman's smile widened. "They're lucky to have you." Logan watched as Sadie's pups bounded toward the golden retriever, their tiny barks filled with curiosity. Sadie followed, her posture relaxed but watchful. "She's come a long way," Logan said softly, mostly to himself. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Logan sat on the porch with Sadie at his side. The pups were curled up together in the living room, exhausted from their adventure. The quiet moments like this had become Logan's favorite, just him and Sadie, the world fading into the background. He reached down, his hand brushing against her fur. "You've changed my life, you know," he said. "I thought I was rescuing you, but it feels like it's the other way around." Sadie looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with trust and understanding. Logan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You're a miracle, girl. You and those pups." In the weeks that followed, Logan found himself inspired by Sadie's resilience. Her story, once a source of fear and uncertainty, had become a beacon of hope not just for him, but for the entire community. With April's help, Logan began organizing a small charity to support stray animals in the area. They named it Sadie's Hope, a tribute to the dog who had brought so much light into their lives. The charity started modestly, with local donations and volunteer efforts. Logan shared Sadie's story online, and the response was overwhelming. People from all over the country reached out, offering support, sharing similar stories, and expressing their admiration for Sadie's courage. "This isn't just about Sadie," Logan said during one of the charity's first meetings. "It's about every animal that's been abandoned, every creature that deserves a second chance. Sadie showed me what it means to fight for hope, and I want to give that to others." One day, Logan received a letter in the mail. It was from a family in a neighboring town who had seen Sadie's story on the news. "We have a Labrador who looks just like Sadie," the letter read. "We rescued her a few years ago, and she's brought so much joy to our lives. Thank you for sharing your story. It reminded us of how lucky we are." Logan folded the letter carefully, a smile tugging at his lips. Sadie lay at his feet, her head resting on her paws. "We're making a difference, girl," he said. Sadie thumped her tail against the floor, her silent agreement. That night, as Logan settled in for bed, he couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. The house that had once been a quiet refuge now felt alive with energy and purpose. Sadie and her pups had given him more than he ever thought possible. A reason to hope, a reason to fight, and a reason to believe in second chances. "You're home," he said softly, reaching down to pat Sadie's head. She looked up at him, her eyes warm and trusting, as if to say, "I know,